Okay, welcome everybody to the latest episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, Jon Molik. Episode 47. We are on Israel-Palestine in the response episode, part 2. Now that we've kind of shortened the episodes here, we're getting into these part 1s and part 2s and stuff, but nonetheless, we'll still get the content out and we'll still talk about the topics. But anyways, we have to go to part 2 because we covered a bunch in the first, and I've still got some more things I think to address since we had that initial recording, and here we are now. So we'll cover the second half. We'll see if we're going to do something even further into the future since we've had some updates, one being today on February 10th as I'm recording this, a potential breakdown in the ceasefire negotiations. Now, the negotiations have already happened, but nonetheless, the second part of the second phase, if you will, of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas looks like it may have broken down today. Israel has recalled all of its service members from leave and has put everybody on high alert. And Hamas has claimed that they are not going to continue to transfer hostages that they've had since October 7th. So more details to follow as to why that is happening. I mean, finger pointing has already begun. It's not me, it's them kind of thing. But I guess we'll see. And then we have the update from the newest administration here in the United States, where President Trump has made the claim that he is interested in rebuilding Gaza and taking responsibility. That is the United States taking responsibility for that plot of land and I don't know, potentially moving 2 million Palestinians out of there. I don't know. Certainly we're not going to have a conversation about the political aspect of that. That's not what we're going to do here on the show, but we can certainly address the realities of that opinion. And I think we'll do that maybe in a future episode, but I think it's a good that's a good segue for me to remind everybody that I certainly don't speak for the military or the United States government in any way, the National Guard or any of those things, as we say every episode, just to remind everybody before we get into this. But so let's go through part 2 of the Israel response episode and see where we get. The first thing I want to address is something that happened. Now, I didn't have anybody actually contact me about this. I mean, most of the points that I'm addressing here are in response to a comment somebody made or a question somebody posed, whether that be online or even in person. But this one was basically just something I had watched live on C-SPAN, and that is Elise Stefanik's testimony as she prepares for her nomination, as she was nominated, to be the ambassador to the UN. Now, for those that don't know, if you're not local here, Representative Elise Stefanik is from upstate New York and has, over the last few years, has become connected to now President Trump, but before then, nominee candidate Trump, if you will, and it's become closer to it's become a part of his political sphere, if you will. And she became nominated for the position to the UN as the ambassador. Again, this is not a political episode, so it's really irrelevant whether she's part of any administration. But what is relevant for us here today is the comment that she made while being asked questions. And what she did is that she, in my mind, proved a point that we've made here in previous episodes that I've been saying since the beginning of our discussions on Israel and Palestine and Hamas and Gaza and the whole thing, is that the issue at hand has a religious component, and you should be wary of those that claim otherwise. And again, I've made this clear where I've said, listen, I didn't say that religion is the whole problem, but it certainly plays a role. And she made that absolutely clear when she was asked directly about what's happening in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, depending on your viewpoint there. And she said, clear as day, that Israel, those that live within Israel, the Jews that live in Israel, have a biblical right to the land within the West Bank, within the biblical Judea and Samaria. And I don't know what else to use as an example to prove that religion is a key component in this conflict. Now, I'm not drawing a straw man argument here because it has been said to me, and I have read in books and I've seen in lectures where people say and make the claim there is no religious component. So I'm not just straw manning here and just coming up with some points just so I can argue it. That's not the case. Now, again, I'm not saying everybody believes it, but nonetheless, there are people that do. But that's a perfect point. We have a representative in the United States, well educated. She understands the problem set clearly. She understands the struggles from both sides. And she also adds to that a bit of bias by saying God in some way plays a role. And that's why, in one major argument, we can't get past this. If you are going to have people within power in a country that is close to the administration in Israel agreeing that religion plays a role in who gets what in this back and forth, we are not going to get anywhere. We'll make the same argument as for those on the opposite side of the argument that say, well, I'm not going to remove the Al-Aqsa Mosque from the top of the Temple Mount because Muhammad wouldn't want me to or Allah wouldn't want me to, and so there's a religious component there. This is clearly more than a real estate deal, and it would be absurd to reduce the back and forth, to reduce the conversations of this conflict to such an extent, right? To say just that this is a real estate deal, as some may have used that language. It's clearly not. It's more personal. It's deeper than that. Clearly people are tying religion to this. It's so much more than that. But if you can't remove the religious component and try to make a secular, civil, international law-based decision, I don't know where we can go. I don't know where we can go. We're just not going to get around it, and that's how I see it. At least that's how I saw it based on the evidence of the 20th century, and it just seems to be that's going to be the way that it is in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, why would she say that they have a biblical right to return? Why does that even matter? Now, there isn't anything in particular that in the Bible, for example, she couldn't give you any evidence to say, look at this chapter and verse, and it says right here that no matter what happens in the future, if you're Jewish and you live in the state of Israel, you're owed this land in Judea and Samaria. That's not written anywhere in any way like that. But there is a very significant religious component to, and a religious history to that part of the land, right? So in the Bible, for example, it says that God spoke to Abraham about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. That's written in the Bible. It's in one of the stories in the Old Testament. So, and if you do the calculations, and obviously it doesn't say 60 miles in the Bible, but this is all about scholarship and historical scholarship, and they've come to determine that this is in and around the area of Judea and Samaria, right? Joshua built the nation of Israel from within this land, right? Mount Ebal. And he carved the Torah out of stone for the first time. And this is where the covenant was made, the deal, the promise between the Jewish people and God, and that God would keep the Torah in the land. This is all ties back to the quote-unquote West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So we could go on, and there are, very specific religious, historical stories that demonstrate the value of the land to religious Jews. And I'm not going to take that away from anybody in that it is real for some people. And of course, if you're a believer in the Bible, particularly in the Torah and the Old Testament, you're going to have these reactions and you're going to have this connection to the land in that way. But if we're going to have a conversation about how to move forward in this discussion, to find a compromise between the two peoples that have occupied this land for a very, very, very long time, it seems only rational and logical to me, again, just my opinion, but to remove the religious component. If you don't, we're not going to win, right? There's just going to be no moving forward. And that's what at least the United States has tried to do, generally speaking, at least through its diplomats for years, is to try to mitigate that as much as possible. You look back at Senator Kerry and his years after being in government has acted as a proponent for the two-state solution, and the same thing happened with President Clinton. And most of the diplomats have said, listen, that in the United States, that a two-state solution is the way to go, and we've got to find a compromise around this religious component, right? Or at least the very conservative, fundamentalist religious component. And this ties into the whole settler issue, where a lot of the Jewish people, not just from a nationalistic standpoint, you can have the argument that Jordan invaded Israel in 48 when they declared independence, and the only reason it's called the West Bank is because they took that property after they attacked, and it was on the west bank of the Jordan River. And then eventually in 67, Israel fought back and re-grabbed that land that was originally part of the discussions in 47 and whatever. That's all true. And so there are some settlers that will argue that they are owed that land because it was originally part of the 47 deal, the UN deal, and then the war happened and it's really ultimately Israel's property. But most people from a settler perspective are doing this, are expanding outside of what we call the green line, the line that most people accept, at least the international community accepted for a long time. It's the difference between the West Bank and Greater Israel. And because of religious components, because they really do feel that it is prophetic, that it is a destiny that Israel as a nation returns to Judea and Samaria because of the biblical connection. And so if Israel's best friend from an international diplomatic standpoint, that being the United States, is going to have an opinion administration-wide that in part the Jewish people have a right and a biblical right to the land of Judea and Samaria, then I don't see much happening. Put aside October 7th and all those other things, I don't see much happening, at least as it stands with the West Bank going forward, if we're just going to continue to have that opinion. It's not going to help, right? It's just not going to help. All right. The next point that I want to make is I want to address a comment that I came across over the last couple of weeks, and it was in regards to Gaza in particular. And the argument was that, and let me start off by saying I can see where you might find some logic here, but the argument was that anyone who had done to the Palestinians in Gaza in particular what the Israelis did would have received the same fierce pushback on Israel that the Palestinians have led since things went awry. Let me say that a little differently to be a little bit more clear. The argument was that the Palestinians that live in Gaza don't care that it's Jewish people or Americans or the French or anybody else. It doesn't matter who ended up creating the quote open air prison camp environment that exists in Gaza since 2005, that they would fight back as vigorously and they would rebel and resist regardless. And I just don't think that's based on factual logic. Why do I say that? Of course, on its face, if you don't dig into the greater problems between the two peoples that occupied this land, and this again goes back to the religious component, but if you don't dig deep into the actual problems that are below the surface, it would make sense a little, right? It's like saying in the equivalent, the Europeans came to North America and they caused all this devastation to the Native Americans who lived there. And obviously there ended up becoming problems. And the analogy would be the Native Americans would be just as mad if it was a bunch of Australians who showed up and they put everybody, all the Native Americans on reservations and death and disease and all those things, and they would be equally mad, and everything would have turned out in the same way. Okay, so yeah, on its face, as a surface argument, I guess you can make that argument, but when you go back and you take a look at the differences, the arguments that are made from a religious component between those that live in Gaza and those that live in Israel, the argument doesn't hold up. It just doesn't hold up. In the charter, in Hamas's charter, is the statement that they exist wholly to eradicate Israel off the face of the map. Because Israel doesn't deserve to be a nation, and the Jews don't deserve to live there. That's their point. They never said that about anybody else. They don't have the same problem with Christians, at least as they say it. And they don't have any problem with the Japanese in that way. And to say that they have the problem only because the Jews are there is just ahistorical. Because while it may be true that the few people that live in Palestine may have a direct connection to those that live in Israel, that's fine. But if you want to have the greater argument of it is a problem between the Jews and Muslims in a greater conversation, then you just go back to the Muslim Brotherhood before Israel was even a nation at all. You just go back into the history that we've talked about over the last X amount of episodes that we've had about the issues between Jews, Christians, and Muslims throughout all of history, down to the Crusades and ever since Muhammad was born in 570 and then died in 632, and then Islam spreads out of Arabia. There has always been a problem, generally speaking. Bear with me, I'm broad brushing here, right? I'm not saying every single Muslim and every single Jew. We know that, right? I think we've had enough of these discussions to know that that's not what I'm saying. But generally speaking, we know that we've had this problem before. It's the reason that Israel even exists in the first place. It's the reason the UN felt the need to find a place for the Jewish people to find refuge, because they've been getting their butts kicked around Europe for centuries. And some of that had to do with the Christians, some of that had to do with the Muslims, of course. But to equate simply because they're the people that live next door, and Hamas would treat the Israelis equally like they would the Japanese, is not historical. There aren't any there's no documentation where the Palestinian people have a problem with the Russians, and they have a problem with the Americans, and they have the problem with the Brazilians, right? They certainly don't. And again, this is all pre-Israel. This is all before Israel became a nation in 48, and we had the Nakba, and it kicked everybody out, right? So that argument to me doesn't hold water. There is a special issue. There is a special problem between the fundamentalists, if I can use that term, the fundamentalists of all three of the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that makes the problem special. I'll give you an example of something that happened to me in very, very recently. And if I told this story in previous episodes, bear with me, and I apologize. But when I was traveling in Israel a couple of months ago, and I was walking through the old city in Jerusalem, there was an evangelical Christian American who was standing on a stool, and he had a Bible in his hand, and he was yelling. He was literally yelling that all the Jews that were walking around were, I don't want to say he was calling them evil, but he was basically saying they were all wrong and they were all going to go to hell because they didn't listen to the teachings of Christ. They turned away the Messiah, and they don't follow Jesus' path, and so therefore they're going to all end up in hell, right? That he's not saying that about the Japanese people. He's not saying it about Australians. He's saying it about the Jews who were potentially, if you believe all of the, if you believe everything from the explanations in the Bible, that they turned away and decided to not choose the Messiah that God supposedly sent here to earth, and that would be Jesus, right? There's a special place, a special argument amongst these groups that makes the issues different. The last thing I wanted to discuss really quick before we wrap up, which looks like it's going to be kind of a short little episode here, but nonetheless, is, I saw video recently, and we've seen videos since the ceasefire, where Hamas has come back out in full force and have replenished their numbers. We're talking tens of thousands again, ever since the IDF went into Gaza and routed as many Hamas terrorists out of there as they could. And the ceasefire came into effect a few weeks ago. And again, like I said, Hamas has started to come back into Gaza. They look like in a lot of pictures and a lot of video, they have new trucks. It looks like they have new uniforms. They're green headbands. They all look clean and nice and new. And, clearly they're being funded from the outside. Iran most likely involved, if not other countries. We always we point at Iran as the primary. But what caught my eye was not that Hamas would come back. I mean, of course they would in some way. And I'm not surprised to see, Hamas members carrying AK-47s as they're trying to pass off hostages that are being returned to Israel, and they're all out there screaming and yelling and proclaiming that they're back and they're in charge. And I don't know if anyone would think that wasn't going to happen. But what struck me was the children that are riding in the back of these pickup trucks. That's mainly what Hamas drives around in, these white pickup trucks. And the children are dressed in the exact same way. They have the same headbands, the same black scarves on their face, and the black uniforms, and carrying weapons, just like the adults are. And the only thing that makes them different, because everyone's face is covered, the only thing that makes them different is they're 4 feet tall. While I can understand on some level, right, you want your children, or it's okay on some level to have your children be patriotic, and you want them to support their nation. And, I even remember as a kid, I was in 3rd grade, I think, or something, in 4th grade, and my brother was in 2nd grade or 1st grade. And I remember there's pictures of me, with like camouflage pants on and a camouflage hat and like a Rambo bandana or something, and big American flag on our suits, and we were running around as soldiers and we were being patriotic. Okay, I got it. Like, we all play that stuff. Okay, there's no problem with that. So what I'm saying is, I guess if like Hamas is your ideology, and that is your dad's in Hamas and your uncle is in Hamas, and you have your belief system, and you don't like the Jewish nation, and you want to fight for freedom in your mind, and okay, and you dress your kids up a little bit, okay. I guess I'm not really having a problem with that if you're to make that comparison between us and them, right? I'm not obviously calling the United States like Hamas. I think you get the point. But they are carrying real weapons, and they're in the back of pickup trucks that are literally being used in combat. And then people ask, how outrageous is it that children are dying when they're involved in combat with the IDF? The IDF doesn't care about anybody, and they're even going around killing innocent children. Wait a minute. Do you know what I've never seen? And again, I've been to Israel, and I've read a lot, and I see enough about what happens in Israel. You know what I've never seen? I've never seen children in an IDF uniform. I've never seen, and when I say children, I don't mean the 18 and 19-year-olds that join the army. I'm talking about, the 10-year-olds. They're not anywhere near the battle space. They're not dressed up in IDF uniforms with weapons. They're not doing that. The children are not anywhere near what the adults are doing. And so you're not going to hear stories about small Jewish boys being killed by Hamas terrorists in the middle of wherever they're having a battle. It doesn't exist. But it does exist on the opposite side. You do hear stories of children dying in combat. Now, why do you think that is? Even if you're a supporter of the Palestinian resistance, the Palestinian movement, and completely removing Israel from Gaza and from the West Bank or whatever, all of that's fine. Even if you're a supporter of that, you cannot make the argument that if given the chance, Hamas wouldn't kill Israeli children. You can't do that, right? Hamas has already demonstrated how vile and evil they can be. It's already come out on October 7th, and we've already had that conversation. So are you going to tell me if Israeli children were in combat, Hamas wouldn't try to kill them? Of course they would. Not Palestinians in general. Again, I'm talking about Hamas members. Of course they would. But it doesn't happen. Why? Because there are no targets. There are no Israeli children involved in combat. They're nowhere near it. But that is not the case for Hamas. And so if you have a pickup truck full of Hamas fighters in the back, and a couple of them are children, which you can clearly see on these videos, and they come up against some battle with the IDF, or the IDF is, setting up ambushes, whatever they're doing in combat there in Gaza, and children end up dying. It's not, you can't have it both ways, meaning like the only way to protect those children is to not fight at all. That would be the only way to do it. But that's exactly the purpose. That's what Hamas is doing. Hamas is bringing those children specifically to the fight because they feel like it's of value. They feel like it's worth it. That if their children are martyred, it's a benefit to them. It makes Allah happy. It's Allah's wish. And it also benefits them because then they could just blame Israel. We cannot make the assumption that because children are dying in combat in Gaza, they happen to be in combat, and they ended up coming up dying. Again, just Hamas children, no IDF children, no Israeli children. You cannot make the automatic assumption, well, it's because the Israelis don't care about anybody and they just want to kill innocent kids. That is a logical fallacy. And you have to think more deeply about this. These kids are just riding around in the back of these pickup trucks. There is no reason for them to be there. None. And that goes back to the whole conversation we've had in an earlier episode of where are we on the moral level here? Where are we on the ethical level between both of these groups? I just don't think we look at the world in the same way. I say we, but from like a Western perspective, if you will, a Western democratic Republican perspective where people have rights and we don't bring children to combat. I just don't think we see things in the same way. And by the way, some of that mentality goes back again to a religious component. There is a belief that this kind of behavior makes Allah happy, and so there's an afterlife, and the kids that are involved are going to end up living eternity in heaven with Allah, and everything will be fine, and it's, them fighting the Israelis and children dying is just all a good thing, right? Ultimately. All right. I think we got through the last couple of points here on our response episode. Part 2 was a little choppy today. I understand that. I apologize, but we got through it. We got through some of these points, and we'll be moving on. So I know I've been spending a lot of time on the Israel-Palestine stuff over the last bunch of episodes, but I did travel there, and it's been top of mind, and it's in top of the news as well. Obviously, we just had another update today, as I had said earlier, about potentially the ceasefire breaking down. So it is stuff that we're dealing with today. It's relevant. And it's in the news, so headlines in history, we're gonna talk about this stuff. So thanks for joining me here today. Again, head off to headlinesinhistory.com, follow me on social, YouTube, X, Blue, Sky, all of that stuff. And thanks for joining me, and we will see you next episode.